In the early 1950s, William Burroughs wasn't the only American with an interest in peculiar technologies to manipulate the human mind. And not all such technologies were manufactured in the South American rainforests. On April 15, 1953, just as Burroughs had returned to Bogota, Colombia, following his second ayahuasca experience, CIA Chief Alan Dulles approved a top-secret program to study unconventional techniques for modifying an individual's behavior by covert means. Wired interfaces to control the brain like a computer, electroshock treatments, forced lobotomies, and, of course, drugs. The program was christened with the now infamous codename MK Ultra. The intelligence arms of the US government had been experimenting with methods of covert mind control since the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947, and had already tried and ultimately rejected a number of prospective truth drugs, including the psychedelic peyote alkaloid mescaline, the deliriant scopolamine, potent extracts of cannabis, as well as a range of sedative barbiturates. And, not surprisingly, when Albert Hofmann's extraordinarily potent ergot derivative, LSD, appeared in the early 1950s, the agency was keen to add this new drug to its repertoire. The techniques employed, or at least proposed by the agency, have since become the stuff of legend, dropping LSD into the water supply of an enemy city to render its population unable or unwilling to defend itself, testing the effects on Special Operations Division officers by spiking their Cointreau during a 3-day retreat, leading one man to commit suicide shortly after, setting up safe houses where men would be enticed by prostitutes and wind up drugged with LSD while being watched by agents behind two-way mirrors, as well as slipping the drug into the drinks of random members of the public in bars, clubs, and restaurants, and observing their reactions. At the height of their covert LSD program, Sandoz, the sole manufacturer of LSD at the time, was supplying the agency at a rate of 100 grams per week, enough to dose up to 1 million people, allowing them not only to monopolize the supply of the drug, but also to dominate research into its effects. But the agency wasn't satisfied with only testing drugs that were likely already on Soviet radar. They wanted something entirely new. So, when they caught whiff of a mysterious mushroom cult rumored to be operating in southern Mexico, the agency dispatched a young scientist to Mexico City to locate and collect samples of the magical fungi to test on its willing, or in some cases entirely unwitting, human subjects back in the States. He eventually returned with samples of psilocybe magic mushrooms, as well as 10 pounds of the psychedelic LSA, lysergic acid amide, containing seeds of Rivia corymbosa, ololiuki. All the agency needed now was a suitably qualified and morally ambiguous individual to perform the experiments on human subjects. One such scientist on the agency payroll was pharmacologist Harris Isbell, director of the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. Unlike other scientists who would have to go through a protracted period of recruitment to gather volunteers for research into novel pharmaceuticals, Isbell had privileged access to a practically inexhaustible supply of test subjects from a, quite literally, captive population. It was a matter of sheer coincidence that Isbell's Addiction Research Center just happened to share its campus with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, who, in 1953, was responsible for the custody and care of over 20,000 federal inmates. Recruitment from this population was straightforward. The word was discreetly injected into the Bureau's prison network that anyone who volunteered for Isbell's research would be rewarded with either reduced time or a limited supply of top-notch heroin that wouldn't have raised an eyebrow had it found its way into the president's own personal stash. They almost always chose the latter. The only catch was that, while inmates were told that they would be required to ingest one or more experimental drugs, they weren't privy to any further information, neither the name or type of drug, nor any possible effects. The obligatory informed consent forms were signed, legal waivers granted, and Isbell had complete carte blanche. Inmate volunteers would be awoken early, denied breakfast, and the drug administered at precisely 8 a.m., either mixed with raspberry syrup to disguise the taste, or, in the case of LSD, a few drops of the solution were simply soaked into a graham cracker. Any attempts to create a relaxed, comfortable, or reassuring environment were entirely foregone. The inmates lay on a standard hospital bed, and as the effects of the drug took hold, would be at the mercy of the doctors' prods, pokes, and interrogations, but most of all, at the mercy of their own minds. Although their experiences were occasionally pleasant, even fantastical, trips to the moon or living in gorgeous castles, considering the less than optimal setting for a psychedelic trip, and given that the subjects invariably had absolutely no prior experience with these highly unusual states of consciousness, more often than not, they were marked by nervousness, anxiety, and outright paranoia, with some inmates fearing insanity or believing their minds to be controlled by the investigators. Although Isbell seemed to delight in his work, the inmates understandably grew fearful of the doctors in the experimental wing of the institute. But the draw of first-rate heroin was too much to resist, so, slippered and hungry, they marched to the special ward for their treatment, with no more of an idea as to what might befall them that day than Isbell himself. And if they were at least expecting some kind of compassion or concern for their welfare, they most certainly would have been disappointed.